Except for a carpenter, everyone refused to save the abandoned, paralyzed woman. Wild West story. Dust swirled through the streets, carried by a constant dry wind, settling in corners, on window sills, and in the furrows of people's worn faces. Life in Red Creek was harsh. Every day brought its challenges, from the unpredictable weather to the scarcity of supplies. The townsfolk had learned long ago that survival required caution, toughness, and most importantly, staying out of trouble. Rumors had begun to circulate quietly at first. They spoke of a woman who lived alone on the outskirts of town, abandoned in a cabin that was little more than a ramshackle structure held together by hope and desperation. Some said she had once been full of life and laughter, a bright spirit whose smile could warm even the coldest days. Others whispered darker tales, claiming her family had left her behind after a terrible accident left her paralyzed from the waist down. Her limbs, once strong, had become unresponsive, and she could no longer walk, carry, or tend to herself. The stories reached the ears of most townspeople through hushed conversations in the saloon, at the general store, and near the water troughs. But with each retelling, the woman became more of a specter than a person. "Why bother?" some said, shaking their heads. "She can't help herself, and helping her will only bring trouble." Fear clung to them like the ever-present dust. Fear of bandits, of wild animals, of scarcity, fear of responsibility itself. In the center of this small, wary town lived Samuel, a carpenter known for his quiet demeanor and skilled hands. Samuel had arrived in Red Creek a few years earlier, seeking a fresh start after losing his family to illness in a faraway town. His heart bore the scars of grief, yet unlike most, he had not grown bitter. Instead, he carried a deep compassion, a sense that helping others was a duty, not a choice. While the townsfolk focused on survival and gossip, Samuel listened to the stories of the paralyzed woman with growing concern. Something about her plight struck a chord deep within him, a mixture of sorrow, empathy, and the quiet voice of conscience that refused to be ignored. One afternoon, Samuel stood outside his small workshop, wiping sweat from his brow as he watched the wind dance through the streets. He overheard a group of men at the saloon talking about the cabin on the edge of town. Their words were sharp, tinged with mockery and indifference. "That woman is as good as dead," one said, laughing. "Why anyone would waste time on her is beyond me." Another added, "The sheriff says it's dangerous out there. Wild animals, maybe bandits. She's better off left alone." Samuel listened silently. He felt a pang of anger, not at the townsfolk but at the callousness of fear. He knew the risks, they were real. The outskirts were wild, untamed, and unforgiving. The cabin itself was barely standing, its roof sagging, its door hanging crooked. Yet the thought of leaving a helpless woman to fend for herself was unbearable. He could not stand by while others turned away. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of orange and gold, Samuel made a decision. He gathered a few essential supplies, a bucket of water, some bread, dried meat, and blankets, and set out toward the cabin. The road was rough, a narrow trail flanked by scrub and thorny bushes, with rocks that threatened to twist an ankle with every step. Samuel's boots crunched against the dry earth as he walked, each step carrying a sense of purpose that pushed away the unease gnawing at him. When he reached the cabin, the sight of it was more heartbreaking than he had imagined. The wood was rotting in places, the windows were broken, and the wind whistled through gaps in the walls like a mournful song. Inside, dust covered every surface and the remnants of a hasty departure, an overturned chair, a cracked plate, a blanket thrown across the floor, told of a life abandoned. And there, lying on the floor with eyes wide and unblinking, was the woman. Her body was frail, her hair tangled, and her hands trembled slightly as if reaching for something just out of reach. When she saw Samuel, her eyes widened in a mixture of fear and relief. No one had come for her in months, and the sight of another human being was at once terrifying and comforting. Samuel knelt beside her, speaking in a calm, gentle voice. "I'm Samuel," he said. "I came to help. You're not alone." His words seemed almost foreign to her ears, yet she felt the warmth of their meaning. Slowly, she nodded, unable to speak clearly, but the motion was enough. Samuel immediately understood the magnitude of the challenge before him. This woman could not move, could not care for herself, and every day presented dangers he had to manage: hunger, thirst, and the unpredictability of the environment. But Samuel's determination was unwavering. He began by cleaning the cabin as best as he could. He swept away layers of dust and debris, repaired the broken door so it would close against the wind, and patched the roof with whatever materials he had. It was exhausting work, but Samuel did not allow himself to falter. As he worked, he talked to the woman, not expecting a response, but believing that hearing his voice would bring her some comfort. "It's going to be all right," he said, arranging a blanket so she could sit more comfortably. "We'll get you stronger. You'll have food, water, and warmth." Her eyes followed his every move, a flicker of hope sparking in their depths. For the first time in months, she felt someone care, not out of obligation, not out of fear, but out of genuine kindness. Night fell over Red Creek, and the wind carried with it a chill that seeped through the cabin walls. Samuel lit a small lantern, its warm glow illuminating the dusty interior. The woman shivered slightly, and he draped an extra blanket over her shoulders. They sat together in silence, the only sounds the wind and the occasional creak of the cabin. In that quiet moment, an unspoken understanding passed between them. Samuel was here to stay, and she was no longer abandoned. The journey ahead would not be easy. Samuel knew that he would face ridicule from the townsfolk, who could not understand why he would devote his time and energy to someone others had deemed hopeless. He knew that every day would be a battle against exhaustion, the harshness of the environment, and the woman's own struggles. But he also knew that this was a fight worth fighting. Compassion, he realized, required courage. And he had enough of both to see this woman through the dark days ahead. Outside, the town continued its routine, unaware of the small act of bravery unfolding at the edge of their streets. The saloon was filled with laughter and card games, the general store with merchants haggling over prices, and the water trough with children playing in the dust. No one noticed Samuel's lantern flickering through the cabin window, a tiny beacon of hope in a world that had long forgotten kindness. Inside, Samuel and the woman began the slow, painstaking process of survival together. He fed her, helped her adjust her position, and kept her company through the long night. Each small action carried weight, each gesture of care a step toward restoring her dignity. And in those moments, Samuel realized that heroism did not always come from grand gestures or fame. It came from showing up, even when no one else would, and choosing to fight for another human being's life and hope. By the time dawn broke, painting the sky in pale shades of pink and yellow, Samuel had settled into a rhythm. He had gathered firewood, set out water for the day, and planned his next steps carefully. The woman, though still fragile, had a small smile on her lips, a glimmer that told him he was making a difference. And for Samuel, that smile was enough. It was proof that even in the harshest corners of the Wild West, humanity could thrive. One small act of courage, one choice to care, had begun to change everything. The days that followed Samuel's first visit to the cabin were a quiet battle of endurance and hope. Every morning, the sun rose over the dusty plains, casting long shadows across the town of Red Creek, and every evening it sank below the horizon in a wash of gold and crimson. Inside the small cabin on the outskirts, the world was smaller, contained within 4 wooden walls, but no less intense. Samuel found himself waking before dawn, carrying water from a nearby creek and preparing simple meals to ensure the woman's survival. She remained in her frail state, unable to move beyond a few small gestures, yet each day that he tended to her needs, her trust in him grew. The townsfolk continued their pattern of avoidance. They whispered behind closed doors, questioning why Samuel would waste his time on someone they considered beyond help. "It's foolish," one woman said while sweeping the porch of the general store. "Why bother with someone who can't walk, can't work, can't do anything?" Another man, leaning against a post outside the saloon, snorted. "That Carpenter's crazy. No one in their right mind spends all day helping a helpless woman." Their words carried judgment, but also curiosity, and slowly the story of Samuel's devotion began to ripple through the town, unseen by those who mattered most. Inside the cabin, Samuel worked tirelessly. He reinforced the roof with whatever wood he could salvage, patched gaps in the walls, and repaired the crooked door. Every nail he hammered, every plank he adjusted, was a promise, silent but unbroken, that the woman would not be abandoned again. He cleaned the cabin with care, removing layers of dust and debris that had built up over months, perhaps years, of neglect. The air, once heavy with the smell of decay, began to carry a faint scent of hope, of life returning slowly to a forgotten place. The woman, whose name was Margaret, had been alone for so long that she barely remembered how it felt to be cared for. Her body had grown weak, and her mind had become quiet from months of isolation. At first she could barely meet Samuel's gaze, ashamed of her condition and afraid of judgment. But Samuel never pressured her. He spoke softly, explaining each action, each movement, each small adjustment. "I'm going to help you sit more comfortably," he would say. "We'll make this place safer. You don't need to be afraid." His words were steady, a constant anchor in a world that had been chaotic and lonely for her. Margaret began to respond in the smallest ways. A flicker of her eyes, a weak nod, or a tentative reach for a piece of bread became signals of progress. Samuel celebrated each small victory, understanding that real recovery, whether physical or emotional, could not be rushed. Every day he carried her to the window so she could see the world outside, the dusty roads, the distant hills, and the occasional passerby. Even the simplest view reminded her that life continued beyond the cabin and that she was not invisible. Life in the cabin was not without its dangers. Red Creek's outskirts were wild and unpredictable. Coyotes howled in the night, their cries eerie and relentless. Storms swept through the plains, tossing debris and battering the fragile structure with wind and rain. One particularly violent night, a storm tore across the area, rain pouring through cracks in the roof and water pooling on the cabin floor. Samuel worked tirelessly, moving quickly to cover the leaks with whatever wood and cloth he could find. He built makeshift barriers to protect Margaret, holding her close as the wind howled around them. She trembled, not just from fear, but from the unfamiliar sensation of safety and warmth in another's presence. Through these trials, Margaret began to open her heart. She spoke of her life before the accident, a small family farm, a younger brother she adored, and parents who had tried their best but could not prevent the tragedy that had left her paralyzed. Her voice was weak at first, barely more than a whisper, but Samuel listened without interruption, without judgment. He never interrupted with his own stories, understanding that for Margaret, being heard was as vital as being fed or clothed. The act of listening became a bridge between their worlds, connecting them in trust and mutual respect. Food and supplies were constant challenges. Samuel often had to make long walks to town, balancing buckets of water and simple rations while navigating rough terrain. The townspeople, still hesitant, occasionally cast curious glances as he passed, but no one offered assistance. Yet Samuel did not complain. Each trip was an opportunity, each small meal a step toward keeping Margaret alive and hopeful. He taught her to eat small portions, to conserve energy, and to use her limited mobility in ways that allowed her to gain strength gradually. It was a slow process, but progress, however tiny, was progress nonetheless. Samuel's compassion extended beyond basic survival. He understood that isolation could erode the mind as much as the body. He told stories, not of his own tragedies, but of hope, of simple joys in life, of moments of kindness he had witnessed in the town. Sometimes he would hum a tune while repairing the roof, letting the sound fill the cabin and push back the silence that had dominated Margaret's life for so long. She listened, sometimes nodding in recognition, sometimes smiling faintly, but always absorbing the reassurance that someone cared deeply for her well-being. As the weeks passed, subtle changes became noticeable. Margaret's posture improved, her eyes regained a hint of sparkle, and she began to respond to Samuel with small gestures. A hand raised to signal thank you, a faint smile when he placed a blanket around her shoulders, or a soft murmur when she wanted water. All these moments were victories in their quiet, unassuming way. Samuel never overlooked them, celebrating each as a testament to human resilience and the power of compassion. One day, as Samuel worked to secure a broken window, a neighbor from town, curious and hesitant, called out from the edge of the property. "Samuel, are you sure you can manage all of this alone?" The question, though simple, carried layers of concern and mild disapproval. Samuel paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and turned to the neighbor with a calm, unwavering expression. "I have to," he replied simply. "She's alive. She deserves help. That's reason enough." The neighbor, unsure how to respond, nodded slowly and retreated, leaving Samuel to continue his work. Evenings in the cabin became moments of reflection and quiet learning. Samuel taught Margaret to shift slightly in her position to avoid bed sores, to hold utensils carefully, and to conserve her strength for essential movements. He encouraged her to speak, to describe what she remembered from before the accident, and slowly she began to tell him stories of childhood adventures, of dreams she once held, and of hopes she still secretly nurtured. Each story was a thread, weaving them closer together and restoring a sense of humanity to a life that had been stripped bare by circumstance and neglect. Through it all, Samuel never allowed himself to think of the task as a burden. Even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, even when supplies ran low or storms battered the cabin, he persisted. He knew that Margaret's survival depended not just on physical care, but on the quiet, steady presence of someone who refused to abandon her. In a world that often judged worth by strength and productivity, Samuel understood that true value lay in the care and respect shown to those who could not fend for themselves. By the end of the first month, Margaret was no longer a shadow of despair. She could lift her head, signal for attention, and respond with small movements to Samuel's instructions. The cabin, once a place of decay and loneliness, had begun to feel like a home, modest, fragile, but alive with the sense that life could endure even in the harshest conditions. Samuel, ever patient, continued his work, understanding that the road ahead was long but worth every step. And as the sun set over Red Creek, painting the plains in hues of gold and amber, the small cabin at the edge of town held a quiet promise. It was a promise that even in a world ruled by fear, indifference, and hardship, courage and compassion could create a sanctuary. Samuel had come not just to help a woman survive, but to restore dignity, hope, and a sense of belonging. And Margaret, for the first time in months, felt the stirrings of trust and the fragile but powerful hope that life could, indeed, continue. The days in the cabin passed slowly, each one a mixture of routine, care, and quiet struggle. Samuel had grown accustomed to the rhythm of life at the edge of Red Creek, rising before the sun and working tirelessly to ensure Margaret's survival and comfort. Despite the harsh environment, he maintained a sense of purpose that carried him through the long hours. Each movement, each small task, was a step toward giving Margaret not only safety but a life worth living again. The challenges they faced were relentless. Food was scarce, and Samuel had to travel long distances to fetch supplies from town. The journey was often perilous, with uneven terrain and the occasional predator roaming near the outskirts. Yet, Samuel never faltered. He balanced buckets of water and baskets of food, always mindful of keeping Margaret fed and hydrated. His hands were calloused from years of carpentry, but his care for her was gentle and precise, ensuring that every meal was prepared in a way she could manage. Margaret's condition made every task a trial. She could barely move her lower body and relied on Samuel for even the simplest needs. Yet, in the midst of this dependency, a bond was forming between them. Margaret began to trust Samuel completely, recognizing the patience and respect with which he treated her. She began to attempt small movements under his guidance, a lift of the arm, a turn of the head, a slight adjustment in posture. Each effort was met with encouragement, never criticism, and slowly she began to regain a sense of control over her own body, however limited it remained. The cabin itself was a constant source of worry. The wooden structure, weakened by age and neglect, required constant attention. Samuel spent hours reinforcing the roof, sealing cracks in the walls, and securing windows to keep out the wind and rain. Each repair was a race against the elements, as storms swept through the plains with little warning. One night, a particularly violent storm tore across the land. Rain poured through gaps in the roof, and the wind rattled the walls as if trying to force its way inside. Samuel worked through the night, holding Margaret close, moving her from one dry spot to another, and patching leaks with whatever materials he could find. The storm lasted hours, and by morning both were exhausted, yet unbroken. Through these trials, Margaret began to share more of her past. She spoke of the accident that had left her paralyzed, recounting the fear, pain, and confusion she had felt in the days that followed. Samuel listened attentively, never interrupting, never judging. He understood that her words were not just stories, but a way to reclaim her identity, to assert that she was more than her disability. With each retelling, Margaret grew stronger, her voice gaining confidence, her eyes showing glimmers of determination that had been hidden beneath fear and isolation. Even the simplest moments carried significance. Samuel taught Margaret how to eat with minimal effort, how to adjust her position to avoid discomfort, and how to communicate her needs more effectively. He encouraged her to express herself, to tell him what she remembered of her life before the accident, and to envision what she might still achieve despite her limitations. These lessons were slow and painstaking, but they were crucial. Each small victory brought a sense of accomplishment and hope that Margaret had not felt in months. Isolation, however, was a constant challenge. The town continued to watch from a distance, hesitant to interfere or offer help. Some townsfolk mocked Samuel's dedication, while others quietly questioned his motives. Yet, Samuel paid little attention to their opinions. His focus remained solely on Margaret, and he understood that his perseverance was as much about proving something to himself as it was about ensuring her survival. The act of caring, of refusing to abandon her, had become a defining purpose in his life. As the weeks turned into months, the bond between them deepened. Margaret began to rely on Samuel not just for physical assistance, but for emotional support. She would reach for his hand when frightened, offer a faint smile when reassured, and occasionally attempt a word or two of conversation. Samuel, in turn, treated each interaction with patience and respect, understanding that her progress was fragile and required constant nurturing. He never pressured her, never allowed frustration to show, and always celebrated even the smallest improvements with quiet encouragement. The harshness of life on the outskirts of Red Creek was matched only by the tenderness that grew within the cabin. Samuel found ways to bring small joys into their daily routine. He would hum while working, telling stories of the town, of its people, and of simple pleasures he remembered from before he arrived. Margaret listened, sometimes responding with gestures, sometimes with quiet laughter, and sometimes with tears. Each response, no matter how small, was a victory in a world that had once seemed hopeless. One particularly difficult day tested their resilience. A sudden heat wave struck the region and the cabin became stifling. Water was running low, and the sun's intensity made even the simplest task exhausting. Margaret struggled to maintain her strength, her body wilting under the heat. Samuel did not rest. He carried her to the shade of a patched window, fanned her with a makeshift device, and carefully rationed the remaining water. He spoke softly, reassuring her that they would get through it together. By evening, when the temperature finally began to drop, Margaret had survived another trial, and Samuel's quiet pride in her endurance was evident. Through these experiences, Margaret began to understand the depth of Samuel's commitment. Unlike others who had abandoned her, he remained steadfast, never judging, never giving up. She learned to anticipate his movements, to communicate her needs with subtle gestures, and to trust that he would always respond with care. In turn, Samuel's understanding of human resilience deepened. He saw that even the most fragile among them could grow stronger with encouragement, patience, and unwavering support. Their days were filled with a delicate balance of survival and growth. Samuel managed the practicalities, food, water, repairs, while Margaret focused on regaining as much independence as possible. Slowly, she learned to feed herself using her limited mobility, to move slightly in bed without assistance, and to communicate more effectively. Each small step was a triumph, a reminder that life could continue even under the harshest conditions. The bond between them was also a source of emotional healing. Samuel, who had carried the grief of his lost family, found solace in his role as caregiver. Margaret, who had endured months of isolation and despair, discovered hope in the constancy of Samuel's presence. Together, they navigated the challenges of survival, each day a testament to the power of compassion, patience, and human connection. Even as progress was made, danger was never far away. Coyotes prowled the outskirts at night, storms threatened the fragile cabin, and supplies from town remained limited. Samuel faced each challenge with determination, often putting himself at risk to ensure Margaret's safety. His hands, once used solely for carpentry, now carried the weight of responsibility and care, repairing, lifting, and supporting in ways that tested his strength and endurance. Yet, amidst the struggles, moments of joy emerged. Margaret would smile faintly when she successfully completed a small task, laugh softly when Samuel told a story, or express gratitude with a simple gesture. Each of these moments reinforced the importance of their efforts, proving that even in a world defined by hardship, kindness and perseverance could bring light to the darkest corners. By the end of the third month, Margaret's physical condition had improved slightly. She could lift her arms higher, adjust her posture more effectively, and participate in small daily tasks. The cabin, once a place of neglect and despair, had become a space of growth and healing. Samuel's dedication had transformed not only her environment but also her outlook on life. She had learned that even in the face of immense difficulty, hope could be nurtured and resilience cultivated. The townsfolk, who had once mocked Samuel's efforts, began to take notice. Some admired his dedication from afar, though few dared to approach. Others whispered that perhaps they had been wrong to abandon her, that courage and compassion could make a real difference. Still, Samuel paid little attention to their opinions. His focus remained on Margaret, on each small victory, each day survived, and each step forward in her journey toward independence. Through it all, the central lesson remained clear. Survival was not solely about physical endurance. It was about connection, trust, and the willingness to care for another human being even when it required sacrifice. Samuel and Margaret had become inseparable in this understanding, their lives intertwined in a delicate dance of care, patience, and shared resilience. As the sun set over the plains of Red Creek, casting long shadows across the dusty landscape, the cabin glowed with the soft light of a lantern. Inside, Margaret rested, her body weary but her spirit strengthened by the unwavering support of Samuel. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, a gentle reminder of the harsh world beyond. And yet, within the walls of the cabin, there was warmth, safety, and the quiet knowledge that they had faced the storm together, and emerged stronger for it. Life at the edge of Red Creek had become a rhythm of careful work, slow progress, and quiet hope. Samuel and Margaret had settled into a routine, each day bringing small victories and, occasionally, setbacks that tested their patience and strength. The cabin, once a place of neglect and despair, had begun to feel like a home, a fragile but growing sanctuary where life could be rebuilt one small step at a time. The bond between them had grown deeper, strengthened by shared struggles and mutual trust. Yet despite these personal victories, the world beyond the cabin remained harsh and uncertain. Samuel had continued his daily journeys into town, bringing back food, water, and other necessities for their survival. Each trip required careful planning, balancing the need for supplies with the challenges of the rough terrain. The roads were uneven, filled with rocks and hidden dips, and wild animals sometimes roamed nearby. On several occasions, he had to navigate through sudden storms, heavy winds, and scorching heat. Yet, Samuel never wavered. He understood that their survival depended not just on the basics of food and shelter, but also on the steady presence of someone who refused to abandon Margaret. Meanwhile, Margaret had made noticeable progress in her recovery. Though still unable to walk, she could now lift her arms higher, adjust her position with less assistance, and perform small tasks that once seemed impossible. Samuel encouraged her every step of the way, celebrating each improvement with quiet joy. "Look at that," he would say, smiling gently. "You did it. You're stronger than you think." His encouragement was never condescending, never rushed. It was patient, steady, and full of belief in her abilities. Slowly, Margaret began to see herself not as a helpless victim, but as someone capable of growth, even in the face of enormous challenges. The townsfolk, who had once mocked Samuel's dedication, began to take notice of his perseverance. Some were curious, observing from a distance as he carried water, repaired the cabin, or guided Margaret through her daily exercises. Others whispered among themselves, debating whether they should offer help or continue to stay away. Samuel, however, paid little attention to their opinions. He had learned that true courage was not about recognition, but about doing what was right, regardless of what others thought. His focus remained solely on Margaret, on ensuring that she had the care, support, and hope she needed. One day, a small group of townsfolk, perhaps inspired by Samuel's example, approached cautiously. They brought food, blankets, and other supplies, their movements hesitant and uncertain. Samuel thanked them, but he was careful not to make Margaret feel dependent on others. "We can use your help," he said gently, "but she is strong, and she can do more than you realize." The townsfolk nodded, their initial skepticism slowly giving way to respect for both Samuel and Margaret. It was a small shift, but it marked the beginning of a larger change, a realization that compassion and perseverance could inspire others to act. Inside the cabin, Samuel continued to push Margaret gently toward independence. He taught her to feed herself using the limited mobility she had regained, to use simple tools to manage basic tasks, and to communicate her needs more clearly. These lessons were painstaking and slow, requiring patience from both of them. Yet each small success built confidence and hope. Margaret began to take pride in her accomplishments, realizing that she was not defined solely by her disability, but by her determination and resilience. As they worked together, Margaret began to open up more about her life before the accident. She spoke of her family, her dreams, and the small joys that had once filled her days. Samuel listened attentively, never interrupting, never judging. He understood that these stories were a way for her to reclaim her identity, to assert that she was more than the sum of her challenges. In sharing her past, Margaret found strength and purpose, and Samuel found deeper insight into the person he was helping to restore. Their efforts were not without setbacks. On particularly difficult days, Margaret would grow frustrated with her limitations, and Samuel would struggle with exhaustion from the constant demands of care. Yet they faced these moments together, supporting each other with patience and empathy. Samuel's presence was a constant reassurance, a reminder that she was not alone in her struggle. Margaret, in turn, learned to trust herself, to recognize the small victories, and to understand that progress, no matter how slow, was still progress. One turning point came during a particularly harsh week. A sudden storm had damaged part of the cabin, leaving a large section of the roof exposed to the elements. Rain poured in, soaking blankets, food supplies, and the fragile floorboards. Samuel worked tirelessly, patching leaks and securing the cabin, while Margaret assisted as much as she could, handing tools and supplies when possible. Through their combined efforts, they managed to protect the cabin and preserve what they could. That week, Margaret realized that even in the face of unexpected challenges, she had the strength to contribute and to endure. As they rebuilt the cabin and adapted to the changing conditions, Samuel began to focus on teaching Margaret practical skills that would help her become more self-reliant. He showed her how to signal for help, manage small household tasks, and maintain personal hygiene with limited mobility. Each lesson was carefully structured to build confidence and independence, and Margaret embraced the challenge. Slowly, she began to see herself not as a helpless woman abandoned by the world, but as someone capable of navigating her own life with support and guidance. The emotional bond between Samuel and Margaret deepened further during this period. Margaret came to rely on Samuel not just for physical support, but for emotional guidance and reassurance. She would reach for his hand when frightened, offer a faint smile when encouraged, and even attempt brief conversation. Samuel, in turn, provided a steady presence, never imposing, never dismissive, and always patient. Their relationship became one of trust, mutual respect, and shared resilience, a partnership forged in the crucible of hardship and strengthened by daily acts of care. Word of their efforts began to spread beyond the immediate area. Travelers passing through Red Creek spoke of the carpenter who refused to abandon a paralyzed woman, of the small cabin at the edge of town where kindness and determination had created a sanctuary. Slowly, the story inspired others in the town to reconsider their own attitudes toward compassion and responsibility. Some began to offer discreet assistance, leaving food, blankets, or tools near the cabin. Others simply observed with admiration, recognizing that Samuel's dedication was not ordinary, but extraordinary in its quiet, unassuming way. Despite these small changes in perception, Samuel never allowed the attention to distract him from the work at hand. His priority remained Margaret's well-being, her progress, and her confidence. He continued to teach her, support her, and encourage her to believe in her own strength. Each day brought new challenges, storms, fatigue, and the constant demand of survival, but each day also brought small victories that reinforced their hope. As Margaret gained more confidence, she began to explore her own capabilities in ways that surprised both herself and Samuel. She learned to use her upper body more effectively, to manage basic daily tasks, and to communicate needs clearly. Each achievement, no matter how minor it might have seemed to an outsider, was a testament to her resilience and determination. Samuel celebrated each success, not with grand gestures but with quiet acknowledgement, reinforcing her sense of accomplishment and self-worth. By the end of this period, the cabin had transformed. It was no longer merely a shelter, but a home filled with life, hope, and purpose. Margaret had regained some independence, learned new skills, and begun to reclaim her sense of identity. Samuel had provided not only physical care, but emotional support, teaching patience, perseverance, and the power of consistent kindness. Together, they had turned a place of despair into a haven of growth and possibility. The turning point, however, was not only in the physical or practical improvements. It was in the subtle shifts in perception. Margaret's renewed belief in herself, Samuel's deepened understanding of human resilience, and the slow awakening of the town to the power of compassion. People who had once dismissed her as hopeless began to see her potential, inspired by the unwavering dedication of the carpenter who refused to give up. Samuel's actions had become a quiet lesson for the community, that true courage is measured not by strength or wealth, but by the willingness to care for those who cannot care for themselves. Even as the town slowly changed, the central focus remained Margaret. She had begun to understand that her value was not defined by her physical limitations, but by her capacity to endure, to learn, and to connect with others. Samuel's guidance had helped her see that strength comes in many forms, and that even in the harshest conditions, life could be rebuilt with patience, effort, and kindness. As the days continued to pass, Margaret's confidence grew, her small victories accumulating into a quiet but steady progress. The cabin, once a place of abandonment and fear, now resonated with hope. Samuel had not only restored her physical environment, but also nurtured her spirit, teaching her that she could survive, thrive, and maintain her dignity. Their shared efforts had transformed both their lives, creating a bond that was unbreakable and a story that would inspire others for years to come. Time passed at the cabin on the outskirts of Red Creek, and life settled into a rhythm that was both steady and fulfilling. Margaret, once fragile and abandoned, had grown stronger in small but meaningful ways. Her body remained limited, and she could not walk, but she had regained control over her upper body, her movements precise and deliberate. Each small act she could perform on her own, holding a cup, arranging supplies, or signaling for assistance, was a triumph. These accomplishments, born of patience and courage, were evidence of the profound transformation that had taken place within her and in the bond she shared with Samuel. Samuel continued his work with the same dedication as ever. Each day brought challenges, whether it was repairing a loose board on the cabin, fetching water from the distant creek, or tending to Margaret's needs. Yet his efforts were now supplemented by occasional help from townsfolk who had begun to see the results of his perseverance. Some brought extra food, blankets, or firewood, and others simply observed quietly from a distance, inspired by what they witnessed. While Samuel never sought recognition, he knew that the gradual shift in the town's attitude was a sign that his commitment had not gone unnoticed. Margaret herself had begun to gain confidence in her ability to interact with the outside world, albeit within the constraints of her condition. Samuel encouraged her to communicate more with visitors, to express gratitude, and to maintain a sense of dignity that had been lost during her months of isolation. The simplest gestures, a nod, a smile, a word or two spoken clearly, became powerful symbols of her resilience and growing independence. With each small achievement, Margaret realized that her life was not defined solely by what she could not do, but by what she could accomplish with determination, patience, and support. One afternoon, a young girl from the town approached the cabin with a basket of fresh fruit. She had watched Samuel and Margaret for weeks, curious and inspired by their efforts. Tentatively, she set the basket down and said shyly, "I thought you might like these." Margaret's face lit up with a genuine smile, the first in a long while that was free from fear or hesitation. Samuel accepted the gift graciously, and Margaret reached out to touch the girl's hand in a gesture of thanks. It was a small, simple moment, but one that symbolized the gradual reconnection of Margaret with the broader community. The town's perception of Margaret continued to shift. People who had once dismissed her as helpless began to admire her determination and the quiet strength she exhibited daily. Some began to offer assistance more openly, whether by providing food, lending tools, or helping maintain the cabin. Others simply observed, learning from Samuel's example that compassion, perseverance, and consistent care could create remarkable change. The story of the abandoned woman and the devoted carpenter became a subtle yet powerful lesson in the value of human kindness, inspiring others to consider how they might act when faced with someone in need. Inside the cabin, the bond between Margaret and Samuel remained at the heart of the story. They had shared months of hardship, of challenges that tested their physical and emotional strength, and of small victories that built hope and resilience. Samuel had become not only a caregiver, but also a teacher and friend, guiding Margaret through the difficult journey of reclaiming her independence and dignity. Margaret, in turn, had learned to trust, to persevere, and to find strength within herself, even when circumstances seemed insurmountable. Margaret's growth was not limited to physical improvement. She had regained a sense of self-worth and purpose that had been lost in the months of abandonment. Samuel encouraged her to express her thoughts, to share her memories, and to envision what her life could still become. Through storytelling, conversation, and shared activities, Margaret began to rebuild her identity, seeing herself not as a burden but as a valued individual capable of contributing meaningfully to her own life and, gradually, to the community. One particularly meaningful day, Samuel helped Margaret to the window so she could see the town below. Children played in the dusty streets, merchants tended to their shops, and neighbors carried on with their daily routines. Margaret's eyes followed their movements, and for the first time in months, she felt a connection to the world beyond the cabin. Samuel held her hand gently, guiding her to observe without fear. "It's out there," he said softly. "It's a world full of life, and it's waiting for you." Margaret nodded, a sense of hope and possibility blooming within her. As the seasons changed, Margaret and Samuel adapted to the challenges of the environment. Harsh winds, scorching sun, and occasional storms tested their resilience, but each challenge was met with careful preparation and cooperation. Samuel had taught Margaret techniques for managing her condition, from positioning her body to performing small tasks independently. Each success reinforced her confidence, and each trial strengthened their partnership. Together, they had created a space where safety, dignity, and hope could coexist, even in the unforgiving Wild West. The impact of their story extended beyond the cabin. Townsfolk, inspired by Samuel's dedication and Margaret's courage, began to reconsider their own actions and attitudes toward others in need. Some started to volunteer discreetly, offering assistance to those who had been neglected or overlooked. Others simply observed and reflected, understanding that true heroism was not measured by wealth, status, or bravado, but by the willingness to act with compassion and integrity. Samuel and Margaret had become an example of what could be achieved through patience, empathy, and unwavering commitment. Despite the gradual support from the town, Samuel remained focused on the personal care and growth of Margaret. He understood that her recovery, though limited by her physical condition, was a journey that required constant encouragement, practice, and reassurance. He continued to teach her new skills, challenge her to accomplish small tasks, and celebrate each achievement. In doing so, he reinforced the lessons of resilience, patience, and self-belief that had carried them both through the most difficult times. Margaret's own sense of agency grew as she learned to navigate her life with more independence. She took pride in the small tasks she could accomplish, in the ability to communicate her needs effectively, and in the knowledge that she was no longer defined by helplessness. Each day, she discovered new strengths within herself, and Samuel provided the guidance and support necessary to ensure that these strengths were nurtured and reinforced. The partnership between them had become a source of empowerment, demonstrating that even in the harshest conditions, human resilience and determination could flourish. As months turned into a year, the cabin had transformed completely. It was no longer a place of abandonment and despair, but a symbol of hope, perseverance, and the transformative power of compassion. Margaret, once a shadow of her former self, had become a woman of quiet strength, capable of engaging with the world and asserting her dignity. Samuel, through his tireless care and dedication, had not only restored her physical and emotional well-being, but had also created a legacy of courage and kindness that inspired the town and beyond. The story of Samuel and Margaret became a part of Red Creek's collective memory. Travelers passing through would hear of the carpenter who refused to abandon a paralyzed woman, and of the woman who, through determination and support, had reclaimed her life. Their tales served as a reminder that even in a world filled with hardship, fear, and neglect, individual acts of courage and compassion could create lasting change. It was a lesson in empathy, perseverance, and the enduring power of human connection. Margaret's gratitude towards Samuel was profound, though expressed in quiet, understated ways. She learned to communicate her appreciation through gestures, smiles, and the confidence with which she engaged in daily life. Samuel, in turn, found fulfillment in witnessing her growth, understanding that the true reward of his efforts was not recognition or praise, but the knowledge that he had made a tangible difference in the life of another human being. Together, they had navigated adversity, forged a bond of trust and respect, and created a life filled with hope and possibility. In the final months of their journey, the cabin stood as a beacon of resilience and compassion. Margaret continued to learn and grow, gradually achieving greater independence within the limitations of her condition. Samuel remained steadfast in his support, guiding her with patience, care, and unwavering dedication. The partnership they had formed was a testament to the idea that human connection, empathy, and perseverance could overcome even the most challenging circumstances. As the sun set over Red Creek, casting golden light across the plains, the cabin glowed with warmth and life. Inside, Margaret rested comfortably, confident in her abilities and secure in the knowledge that she was not alone. Samuel, ever vigilant and caring, reflected on the journey they had undertaken together, the struggles, the small victories, the lessons learned, and the hope restored. Together, they had faced a world that had once abandoned her, and they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more resilient. The legacy of their story endured in Red Creek long after the immediate challenges had passed. Margaret's courage, combined with Samuel's unwavering dedication, inspired others to reconsider their own capacity for compassion and responsibility. The town gradually embraced a new understanding of what it meant to care for one another, recognizing that acts of kindness and perseverance could create profound, lasting change. Samuel and Margaret's journey became a quiet legend, a reminder that even in the harshest environments, humanity, hope, and resilience could prevail. In the end, the story was not about tragedy, but about transformation. It was about the power of one person's courage to alter the course of another's life, the ability of kindness and perseverance to create lasting change, and the truth that even in a world filled with hardship, hope could thrive. Margaret had been abandoned, paralyzed, and isolated, yet through determination, support, and unwavering care, she had reclaimed her life. Samuel had risked exhaustion, skepticism, and difficulty to offer her the chance to survive and thrive. Together, they had created a story that would endure in memory and inspire generations to come, a testament to the enduring power of compassion and human resilience.